this was a fun paper because it really does highlight how powerful the relationships are that conform to common sense and don't conform to current prevailing economics wisdom. I think stimulus always involves picking winners and losers, and therefore is always likely to be at least moderately misguided. The countries that spent more grew slower. Keynes himself would be appalled at some of the things that are called Keynesian these days. I don't question the notion of government spending going up in a crisis, but can we please have it go back down after the crisis passes? Please?
Rob, welcome back to Excess Returns. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So Research Affiliates has put out some interesting pieces of research over the past few months, and what we thought we'd do with you today is talk through some of that research and try to get our arms around what the important lessons are for investors and what the implications are for investors. And the paper that we're going to start with is one that challenges one of the most maybe widely accepted ideas, or at least a widely accepted idea in modern economics, and that is that government stimulus always boosts economic growth. And so your piece titled "Stimulus Does Not Stimulate," I think challenges some of this conventional wisdom on stimulus. It shows why not all government spending is created equal when it comes to generating real positive economic output. And so, and we'll put links to all these papers in the show notes. So, and we're also going to be referencing some images and visuals. So if you're listening and you want to pop over on YouTube, that's probably a good place to watch this because you get to see Rob and you get to see the visuals too. So, but I guess
I put on a tie for this.
You're always dressed up. It's great. But I think to start, it's kind of an interesting time to be talking about this because we're really not in a period where, at least right now, where, we're talking about stimulus. But I guess to start out, what led you now to look at this topic today?
It has always bothered me that people keep talking about stimulus, and I've never seen much evidence that it does a lot of good. And it just seems intuitive to me that it should be a little problematical. Spending, whether it's financed by taxes or by borrowing, means taxes are pulled out of the private sector for the government to spend it, or taxes or money is borrowed out of the private sector to fund initiatives. And so it's really more about picking winners and losers than introducing new money into the private sector. It's money pulled out of the private sector and then plowed back in. So picking winners and losers, is that something that we think the government can do really well? I don't. And so intuitively, it just doesn't make sense to me that it would work. So we finally decided, heck with it, let's test it. So we went back over the last 80 years, assembled 80 years of data on the magnitude of government spending. And then the question is, what growth measure do you want to use? Well, the growth measure that makes the most sense is per capita GDP, specifically real GDP. If it's nominal GDP, you're taking inflation into account as if it's growth. So you don't want to do that. You want to take out inflation. And if you've got 3% real GDP growth and the population is soaring by 3% a year, then the average citizen is seeing absolutely no benefit. The economy is growing, but it's growing because the population is growing, not because people are getting wealthier. And so per capita real GDP growth takes out the effects of inflation and the effect of population growth. So you could have a country like Japan or Russia where the population is shrinking upwards of 1% a year, and zero growth is actually a good outcome. Or you could take a country like Nigeria where the population is growing 3% a year, and 1% growth would be a disaster. This corrects for all of that. So we then looked at, all right, how does real per capita GDP growth correlate with spending? And I was utterly unsurprised that the relationship was relentlessly negative. Folks in the economics community will say, of course it's negative. If if the economy is shrinking, you have contracyclical programs where spending will rise. And so, of course, you're going to get a negative result. Well, we didn't focus on single years for that very reason. We focused on rolling 5-year results because if you're boosting spending in a contracyclical way and it doesn't boost real per capita GDP growth on a 5-year window, then I think it's fair to say it failed. We looked at it over rolling 3-year, 5-year, and 10-year. The results are always negative. On a rolling 5-year basis, it's negative in every single one of the 5-year spans of the last 40 years. We also took it back over 60 years in another paper that we're preparing now for an academic journal, and got the same results. Every single 5-year span, the countries that spent more grew slower. Countries that spent more grew slower. The second test was an intertemporal test, which means across time, not across countries. So cross-sectional means across countries, intertemporal means across time. And so for the intertemporal test, the question was, when a country cuts spending, does growth accelerate? Or when it boosts spending, does it decelerate? And for about 80% of the countries, the relationship was, again, negative, again, large. And there was only one country where it was more than trivially positive, and that was, strangely, Switzerland. But be that as it may, overwhelmingly across almost all countries, you spend more, you grow slower. Across going from one country to another, the countries that spend more grow slower. So it's an overwhelming relationship. It's contrary to Keynes, which has been accepted as economics dogma for almost 90 years at this point.
And that's essentially what this scatter plot shows. It's showing all those different 5-year periods, and then you're looking at the 5-year growth rate and the percentage, I guess, of government spending, or the size of government.
And the individual countries move around on the chart. It's not always the same countries on the left, and it's not always the same countries on the right. So the fact that the relationship doesn't change from one 5-year span to another, this is just overwhelming. These 5-year spans all have about the same slope, meaning that a country that spends 10% more relative to GDP than another grows 0.75% slower. That relationship applies in more or less every single 5-year span in the last 40 years and subsequently tested all the way back 60 years. It's an overwhelming relationship, and the economics community hasn't really done a deep dive into this, or if they have, they've deliberately chosen to ignore it because it runs contrary to their narrative.
I mean, that's the thing. It's like this data is pretty clear, but yet this idea that stimulus equals growth has been around for as long as God knows how long. So it's interesting that no one's tackled this.
Yeah, Keynes came out with it in general theory, and general theory is arguably the most important published book in the history of economics. I don't mean the most correct book. The most important, because it has instilled a general set of beliefs that the economics community is overwhelmingly Keynesian now, or more correctly, neo-Keynesian. Keynes himself would be appalled at some of the things that are called Keynesian these days. Keynes believed you should run surpluses during the good times and save up the benefits so that you have resources during the bad times. Tacitly, he was saying there's an economic cycle, truncate the downside by spending more, and pay for it by truncating the upside by spending less. And so his argument was, smooth the cycle. Don't harbor the illusion that you can increase the growth rate permanently. People also talk about a multiplier effect. Government spending goes up, the economy goes up. Well, on one level, that's assuredly true because GDP includes government spending as a component of GDP. So So if the government wants to create a sudden surge in GDP, all they have to do is borrow like crazy, spend like crazy, and create a growth in government spending, which will create a corresponding growth in GDP. That doesn't make people more prosperous. It doesn't give people more money to spend on goods and services. It just creates a bigger government. And so that's another part that's overlooked. But Keynes himself, I think, would be excommunicated from the Church of Neo-Keynesianism, would not be welcome in economic circles today. He harbors this illusion that when times are good, you don't have to spend more than you take in tax revenues.
And to Justin's point, it seems like we're even getting stronger in this. I mean, it seems like we're using stimulus more and more and more as time goes by. So we're actually moving completely in the other direction.
That's exactly right. I mean, we've got $36 trillion in national debt, and people like to compare that with the GDP, which is a little under 30 trillion, and say, well, this is getting a little dangerous. It's 120% of GDP. You think about that tacitly, it's tempting to think about that as, well, gosh, if my home mortgage is 120% of my annual income, so what? That's not a big deal. But it's not quite that simple. The correct measure would be 36 trillion versus how much does the government take in revenues, tax revenues. And I don't have the exact number at my fingertips, but let's say it's 5 trillion. That means that the government owes 700% of its annual tax revenues. Now, how would you feel if you had debt that was 7 times your annual income?
I wouldn't feel great about that.
No, it would not be wise. And that's where we are now. So this is a disturbing pattern. Unfortunately, there's bipartisan embrace of overspending. The biggest exception to that recently has been Doge, but Doge seems to be sputtering a bit at this stage. So I don't know if there's going to be serious efforts to cut spending, but if we're in hock up to our eyeballs, the solution as a person is to cut spending. If as a nation we're in hock up to our eyeballs, the solution is cut spending. And you don't have to cut personal spending, you can cut government spending. So this was a fun paper because it really does highlight how powerful the relationships are that conform to common sense and don't conform to current prevailing economics wisdom.
In the paper, you cited the sweet spot of government spending, something between 15 and 30% of GDP. How did you arrive at that threshold?
We actually did a test where we looked at the link between spending and growth across the 40 years in rolling 5-year spans and found that relationship persistently negative. We then asked the question, well, that graph really starts at 12-14% government spending as a percentage of GDP on up to 60% for some of the more profligate spenders, typically Japan or European Union, both of which have, in my view, a truly crazy level of government spending and intrusion into the private sector, which is why their economies have stalled. By the way, Japan is a beautiful example of a country which had low spending back 40 years ago and has high spending now. And they had stupendous growth 40 years ago. And they have anemic growth ever since they embraced a high spending dogma. So we then asked the question, what about countries with really low spending, say 15% or lower? Well, you don't find that in the developed world. The only places that have been close to it have been Singapore, ballpark of 15% of GDP for the last 60 years, and South Korea 40 years ago was also in the 15 to 20% range. It's now a lot higher. It's now in the low to mid 30s. But be that as it may, outside of the developed economies of the world, you can find lots of examples of countries with negligible spending at 10% of GDP or 5% of GDP or even less. Well, unfortunately, um, that's the domain of warlords and anarchy. Somalia has very little spending. It does not have good, robust, real per capita GDP growth. Uganda, same thing. So what we find is that there's a certain level of spending that's necessary for growing prosperity. You got to have rule of law. You have to have property rights. You have to have an ability to, if you're doing wonderful things for the economy, creating great product, working hard, doing good work, you need to be able to get rewarded for that and to enjoy the fruits of that effort in order to align incentives. And so what we find is that you need to spend enough to create rule of law, to rein in bad behavior. A light hand of regulation is absolutely necessary. A heavy hand of regulation can start to do damage. And you need police, you need fire, you need roads, you need borders. Can't take all comers. If you take all comers without even checking whether they're criminals or good people, that's just stupid. So a certain amount of government is absolutely needed. But when it gets above somewhere in the 15 to 30% range, it starts to do more harm than good. And that's totally unsurprising. And yet it's contrary to received wisdom in the economics community. The EU is full of policymakers who hew to the idea of, well, the government needs to promote a growth agenda. We need to have industrial policy and pick winners and pick losers. I was at a meeting a few weeks ago with a woman named Lawrence Boone. Apparently in France, Lawrence can be a woman's name. She was a senior policy advisor to Hollande and socialist. And she made the comment that we need to boost spending in order for Europe to develop its own cloud technology to compete with the Magnificent Seven. Pardon me, but I kind of doubt if any of the bureaucrats in Paris know enough about the cloud to develop cloud technology that can compete with the Magnificent Seven. Forgive my skepticism there. I don't think they could design it. I don't think they could build it. And I don't think they would know where to put the funds to fund others to do it. Let the private sector do what it does best, which is innovate.
Yeah, battle between Google and a country is probably not going to go well for the country.
Right. And Google these days is often cited as an example of behaving badly, a monopolist. Isn't it interesting that OpenAI has led to millions of people switching from Google as a search engine to AI as a search engine? Well, I made that switch a while back using perplexity.ai as my search engine, and I love it. I don't have pop-up ads, and I don't have a list of 10 sponsored websites before I get to anything useful. And so Google has finally decided we're being disrupted. We'd better disrupt ourselves before others disrupt us, and has moved AI to front burner as part of their search package. You know, what seems like an insuperable lead, what seems like an insurmountable moat, can disappear like that in the face of new technology. Disruptors get disrupted. And so heavy hand of regulation in Europe, which punishes Google for not censoring everything is, I think, a mistake. I think competition will discipline anyone who's not sufficiently innovative.
How about this idea that we have to stimulate during major economic disruptions? Like, I think most people agree that after, the COVID stimulus went on for way, way too long, but you'll still see a lot of people that argue like in that time, we were going to have a depression if we didn't do the stimulus. So, I mean, do you think in certain times like that, it is necessary to do short-term stimulus?
I have a nuanced view on that. I think stimulus always involves picking winners and losers, and therefore is always likely to be at least moderately misguided, is likely to be more unhelpful than helpful. That said, the populace expects government to do something. And so if you have a crisis, the general public will demand, this is a crisis, why aren't you doing something? The correct response may be to say, well, we don't know what to do, and so we're going to do nothing. We don't know what we can do to help here, so we're going to do nothing. That might be the correct response, but it will be unacceptable to the electorate. So there are times, global financial crisis, COVID, where government must do something. I think the correct response is a light hand. During the global financial crisis, ring fence imploding businesses so that they don't have systemic effect that ripples far beyond the boundaries of a particular business. For COVID, I live in Florida, and Ron DeSantis, when COVID struck, initially said, okay, we got to lock things down. And then as he saw the economy imploding, he read I think it was called the Great Barrington Declaration, which was scientists at Oxford and Stanford saying, what you need to do is recognize everyone's going to catch this. Everyone's going to get COVID. You need to slow the spread, and you need to protect the vulnerable, protect the elderly, protect nursing homes. And other than that, everyone's going to catch it. So slow the spread for a few weeks and then let the economy reopen. DeSantis did exactly that. DeSantis basically said after about 6 weeks of rather intense lockdowns, all right, you're grown-ups. Be as safe as you choose to be. Lock down if you want to lock down. We're not going to do that to the economy. And Sweden did the same thing. So when you look at deaths in Sweden and deaths in Florida, what you find is that both had a surge in deaths earlier than their neighbors. But the ultimate death toll, adjusted for demographics, for age profiles, was pretty much the same. So California had fewer deaths per million than Florida did, but Florida is older. California had more deaths per million senior citizens than Florida did. Florida protected the nursing homes. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut had huge death tolls, particularly adjusted for demographics. So that's an example of where the citizenry demands you got to do something. And that's where the correct response would be, okay, we're going to do the best we can. None of this follow the science rubbish when they weren't following science at all. They were following a predetermined policy choice and pretending that science backed it up. Scientific method is about welcoming alternative perspectives, looking at the data, challenging whether your own view is right, and ideally being the first to identify where you might be wrong. In a case like a pandemic, the correct thing to do is to say, eventually everyone's going to catch this. So we don't know what to do, but we think this is probably the correct step. So we're going to do this. We're going to give it a try and see how it works. I think the citizenry would have appreciated that far more than the pound the drum, do what we say, regardless of evidence. And the muzzling of people in saying the Great Barrington Declaration, the scientists involved in that were canceled, ferociously canceled from media, from their colleagues. They were treated as evil, and ultimately their statements of what they thought was the correct response turned out to be correct.
On your point about the expectation of stimulus, I mean, I think that's the challenge with breaking this, right? Is as soon as you get a 2008 level stimulus, people expect that. You get the COVID level
Right.
stimulus, people expect that. And so that's the challenge. Now, maybe because we saw inflation as an actual side effect of stimulus, maybe that helps next time in terms of not doing as much stimulus. But it does seem like breaking that cycle is the challenge.
That's exactly right. And so we spent a lot of time there on COVID, but it's a beautiful example where you absolutely couldn't say we're going to do nothing. If you're the government, you can't say we have a global pandemic, millions of people are going to die, and we're going to deliberately choose to do nothing. You can't do that. And when you have a housing meltdown, you can't say, and you have Lehman Brothers going bust. You can't have government saying, we're going to let things settle out however they settle out. We don't know what the right answer is, therefore we're going to do nothing. What you can do is say, we don't know what the right answer is. Hardly anyone in government likes to say that. But truth to tell, that I don't think the populace would blame them for saying, we aren't sure what the right thing to do is. We think this is the right thing to do, and that's why we're doing it. And that gives you an out to say, okay, that's not working. Let's try something else, instead of locking yourself into a singular response. Financial crisis to say, okay, Lehman just imploded. We just midwifed a sale of Lehman to other companies over the course of a weekend. What we're trying to do is to ring fence jumbo too big to fail entities so that there's not systemic risk that spreads beyond the companies that fail. And that would be, I think, a respected, sensible response that doesn't commit you to doing $1 trillion of stimulus for so-called shovel-ready projects that were mostly bogus.
I want to ask you about the underlying issue behind all this, because we talked about the deficit, and this issue of the debt is something that you get a lot of different opinions on. I mean, I think Ray Dalio has a book either as out or coming out soon where he thinks, a debt crisis is very possible in somewhat the next few years. And then you have other people who think just the consequence here is more inflation, maybe higher rates, but this is not going to be some sort of catastrophe. Like, how do you view the national debt in terms of the issue that it is?
Japan is an interesting counterexample. Japan has national debt that's, I haven't looked at it lately. I think it's somewhere in the 250% of GDP range, which hasn't destroyed Japan. So their debt level is about twice ours, maybe a little more. And Japan hasn't had a catastrophic national bankruptcy or anything like that. They're flirting with it. It could be a catastrophe at some stage. But what it has done and what it does do is to crowd out all other economic activity. So personal debt in Japan is tiny. Corporate debt is tiny compared with other developed economies in the world. And it's tiny because any available cash available to lend to people or companies or government hoovers it up and says, that's mine, I'm taking that. And so you don't get the opportunity for people to say, oh, I'd like to borrow to buy a house or borrow to buy a car, or a company to say, I'd like to borrow to fund a new initiative that I think could be very exciting. The resources aren't there. They're just there for the government borrowing. And so there's a crowding out effect that is self-evident, that is powerful, and that is damaging. Japan used to be a growth powerhouse. Back in the 1980s, the narrative was Japan Inc. They've figured out how to get labor and business to collaborate as allies and to pursue automation and growth initiatives jointly in a win-win fashion. Shouldn't the rest of the world emulate this? Well, what they did was to have relatively light government spending. So the private sector basically was at the helm of deciding where the growth opportunities were, and the growth was stupendous. South Korea was even more so. Ireland versus the UK is a beautiful case in point. I first visited Ireland in 1985, and it was a poor country. It was one of the poorest in Europe. I went on a tour of Waterford Glass, had a lovely tour guide who was full of energy, full of enthusiasm, excited, taking great joy in showing how the cut crystal worked and so forth. And I remarked to her, you obviously love your job. Congratulations on that. And she said, well, if I didn't, I wouldn't be working. And I said, what do you mean? She said, my friends on the dole make more than I do. So I'm making negative income. I'm here because I love it. And I thought, what? You make more money on the dole than working? Okay, no wonder Ireland was poor. Ireland's spending was about 15% of GDP more than the UK 40 years ago. And it's about 15% less as a share of GDP today. Now, what's happened to the affluence of the average Irish citizen? The average Irish citizen is better off than the average UK citizen. Maybe not better off than the average City of London citizen, but for the UK at large, the average Irish person is better off. And I've confirmed this in conversations as recently as a week or so ago with people from both Ireland and the UK. The statistics are a little deceptive there because Ireland's GDP also includes a lot of what I call P.O. box companies, companies that have no business presence in Ireland but have a legal domicile there because of their favorable corporate taxes. And that inflates GDP. But if you take that out and look at GNP, which nobody pays attention to anymore, you're stripping out that part of GDP that consists of products that aren't actually made in Ireland. Per capita GNP is about 20% above the UK, and it used to be about 50% below. Going from 50% of UK's per capita GNP to 120% in 40 years is astonishing. So the point of this paper is not to say government is bad, stop it. The point of this paper is to say, let's have a richer dialogue. If you ask people, do you want government to do more for you? Of course we do. If you ask people, do you want government to do more for you if it reduces future growth and means your kids won't be as well off as they would be otherwise? You're going to get a more nuanced answer. It won't necessarily be no, but it'll be a thoughtful yes if it is a yes. A wealthy economy, and ours certainly is that, a wealthy economy can afford a robust safety net, can afford to take care of those who are genuinely needy. But when you cross the line to take care of those who aren't needy by providing benefits to people who just choose to not do much with their lives, that has the dual effect of rewarding indolence and rewarding lack of initiative. and misaligning incentives. And I think most of us would agree that that's not a good thing. But I think we'd even more emphatically agree with that if we recognize that we're slowing GDP growth as a consequence, and that 3% GDP growth, real per capita GDP growth, means 24 years to doubling. That means that our kids will be twice as wealthy, twice as affluent as we are. 1.5% growth takes 48 years. 1% growth takes 70 years. So do you want prosperity to double in a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations? If it's framed in that way, people will make an informed decision of, I don't want government to do things that aren't necessary if it's going to cause us to grow slower. So that was the essence of the paper. The purpose of the paper was to encourage us to have a more informed dialogue and to point out that Keynes was not 100% right. I mean, I don't question the notion of government spending going up in a crisis. But can we please have it go back down after the crisis passes? Please?
That seems to be the part we missed in the last one.
If you look at the earliest data in this paper was early 80s, but we've taken it back to the early 60s. And if you go back to the early 60s, the average developed economy was spending about 30% of GDP. Now the average developed economy is spending about 45% of GDP. That's a big change.
Well, we've got you here. We might as well shift from one controversial economic topic to the next. So we have to talk about tariffs, I think. And your colleague Chris Brightman wrote a great paper on your website about this. But I just wanted to get your general view on that. And I kind of want to start around this idea of trade deficits, because I think once that chart went up on Liberation Day, this idea of trade deficits has been something everybody's been talking about. And are trade deficits bad? So how do you think people can look at this idea of, is it bad for the U.S. to have these trade deficits with other countries?
Well, firstly, to frame my answer, I would observe that I'm a libertarian. I believe a light hand of government is best, and I believe that the correct rate of tariffs is 0. As a libertarian, that tends to make me a reluctant Republican. I say reluctant because there's lots of Republicans who want to spend like crazy as long as they're spending on their pet projects instead of the Democrats' pet projects. And some of the most hawkish people wanting us to be the world's policemen are on the Republican side. So as a libertarian, I'd love to see 0 tariffs. I find it interesting that Trump in 2019, I think it was, at the G7, said to the G7 counterparties, you want 0 tariffs? Give us 0 tariffs, I'll give you 0 tariffs. And I thought that was interesting. The other thing I think is interesting about Trump is his Bible since his college days has been Art of War, the Sun Tzu book written 2,500 years ago. Art of War says things like, the best victory is one that doesn't require a fight. The best way to avoid a fight is to confuse, distract, and frighten your adversaries. Confusion. We're going to charge 245% tariffs on China. No, it'll be 30%. Distraction. Canada is going to be the 51st state. We're going to annex Greenland. Oh, by the way, Gulf of Mexico? Sorry, it's flanked by Mexico, South America, and the United States. It should be Gulf of America. So from now on, anyone who wants to call it Gulf of Mexico is on my bad list. These are distractions. The other thing that Sun Tzu says is demand far more than you would settle for, and don't ever let anyone know what you'll settle for. I mean, if you read Sun Tzu, everything Trump does is pure Art of War. His book, Art of the Deal, the title was borrowed from Art of War. And if you read Art of the Deal, it reads like Art of War applied to the business world. So I look on him as, well, firstly, I think the hyperventilation and panic attacks relating to his every utterance are amusing. I'm not a big fan of Trump, but I don't view him as a catastrophe who's going to lead us to World War III or some other form of Armageddon. I view him as a pompous, narcissistic bully who has certain objectives that he's determined to get done. That's fine. So anyway, back to the topic of tariffs, correct tariff rate is 0. Tariffs serve to slow trade, and they serve to raise revenues. The paper that I wrote on stimulus shows the Ron curve, which says that if taxes are X% of GDP, GDP growth improves. When it gets above that, it starts to erode. GDP growth starts to slow. The same thing applies to tariffs. These are all variants of the Laffer curve all over again. Laffer curve, you may recall, says if you charge 0 tax, you have 0 revenue. If you charge 100% tax, you have 0 revenue because nobody's going to work. And somewhere in the middle is where revenue is maximized. Why that's controversial, I have no clue. It's self-evident. Same thing applies for GDP growth. Some spending is absolutely needed for a healthy economy. More spending starts to get in the way. The same thing applies to tariffs. A little bit of tariff will raise a lot of revenue. My daily driver is a nice Mercedes, and if it suddenly costs 10% more, am I going to never buy a Mercedes again? No, of course not. 10% is a speed bump. If tariffs are large, 145% on China, briefly raised to 245%. That's not a high tariff that's going to impose big incremental costs on goods from China. That is a tariff that's intended to stop trade. It's a barrier. It says, we don't want to collect any revenues from you because we don't want you to sell anything in our country. So it's the same Laffer curve. There's a point at which you maximize revenues, if that's your goal. Unusual for libertarians, I think a 10% tariff is a speed bump. It's not a big deal. If one country can produce for $40,000 a car that costs us $50,000 to build, creative destruction means this company better respond to competition or it's going to disappear. All right, well, creative destruction is a good thing, but not if it happens super fast. What if it goes out of business and then exchange rates change and this is no longer a cheap car? Ouch. Your domestic production capabilities just disappeared. Put a little 10% tariff in and you wind up creating a speed bump that slows the creative destruction. That's okay. And something that reduces demand for the imported good and raises some tax revenues. I think Trump made a tactical blunder on so-called Liberation Day by not saying we're going to have big, beautiful tariffs and this will help fund a big, beautiful tax cut. I think that would have been greeted by the market more warmly than we're suddenly going to raise 20, 30, 40, 60% tariffs on everything coming into our country. I think that was a blunder. I think his go-to seems to be 10% flat rate tariffs with pressuring trade counterparties to reduce their tariffs. And from that perspective, I think it's hilarious that Wall Street spends so much money trying to model the effects of tariffs when 2 points. One, the tariffs change from day to day. Why are you trying to model something where you don't know what it's going to be in a week, let alone a year? Two, the models. Time, GDP growth or unemployment or inflation or interest rates to tariffs are abysmal. They don't work very well. So why waste your time modeling this? You know that tariffs are going to be inflationary, a little. You know that they would slow GDP growth, all else equal, but you don't know that it's going to have a major impact. And it's also a negotiating tactic. So let's see how it sorts out at the end of the day. Let's see where the tariffs are a year from now, before we freak out.
And I should just mention, to your point about it changing every day, the court struck down the tariffs last night, the night before we're recording this. And by the time it comes out, there'll probably be 5 more changes
Right.
to the tariffs. But just one more for me before I hand it back to Justin. It seems like, I just want to pick up on your idea of this as a negotiating tactic. I mean, it seems like that's probably the best case here, or the best argument for the tariffs. Like, Rob, I'm a pretty horrendous negotiator. And the reason I'm a horrendous negotiator is because I always start in the middle, where I think I want to settle, and I make that my first offer, and I always end up with something terrible.
They're very similar that way. I tend to say, here's what I want, and if you don't like it, then deal's not going to happen, instead of trying to create. But that's what makes Trump very different. So viewed as a negotiating tactic, it's not the end of the day tax. It's the interim tax that is intended to achieve some particular goal.
While we get to the end here, what we wanted to do is just talk to you about what your research affiliates asset allocation tool is sort of showing in terms of expected returns and volatility. And for those that don't know, research affiliates, you have to register. Registration's free, but once you register, you can get in there and you can play around with this tool, which is really cool and interactive, and it shows you the expected returns, either real or nominal, and the expected volatility that research affiliates is estimating on a bunch of different things. But I thought maybe, Rob, it would be good just to hear from you how your capital markets expectation teams actually builds this tool, and then maybe we can get into real quick what some of the opportunities and maybe risks are.
Yeah, I'm really proud of this tool. It was inspired by Jeremy Grantham. Grantham has had real return forecasts for maybe a dozen asset classes for, I think, 30 years. And he simply says, here's the yield, here's the growth in income, and here's how far you are away from historic norms. What if the PE ratio moves back to historic norms over the next 7 years? What'll that do to your returns? Well, I think his approach has some weaknesses. Firstly, it doesn't cover enough asset classes. We cover 130 asset classes. Actually, I'm sure it's more than that by now. Secondly, mean reversion doesn't always happen. The long-term average Shiller PE ratio, price relative to 10-year smoothed earnings for the U.S. stock market, going back over the last 150 years, has been about 18 times. We came into the current quarter at about 34 times. So mean reverting from 34 to 18 would mean a pretty catastrophic 7 years. And our approach is to say, maybe it mean reverts, maybe it doesn't. And maybe if it does mean revert, it mean reverts gradually. So we take that gap, the 34 versus 18, and say, maybe we go halfway. Well, that's 26. Going from 34 to 26 is a slight headwind, and maybe it takes a decade to get there. All right. Well, that takes your return expectation down modestly, but let me just look at what it is for U.S. U.S. large cap stocks. We are showing, here we go. 3.9% return, expected return over the next 10 years, consisting of 1.4% from yield, 5.3% from growth. Now, if you're assuming 2.5 as an inflation rate, that means you're assuming 2.5 real growth in earnings and dividends. So add those together and you've got 6.7%. Not too bad. Not very impressive, but not too bad. But the U.S. is price rich relative to history. If it mean reverts, that might cost you 5 or 6% or more per year, taking your return to zero. Or it might not mean revert at all, leaving you with your 6.7% return. Let's split the difference. Let's assume halfway mean reversion. Let's assume that it takes 10 years. That costs you about 2.8% a year. So 1.4 from income, 5% from growth in income, and minus 2.8 from mean reversion. That gives you a return of 3.9%. Well, ouch, that's less than you get from bonds. So if bonds are priced to give you 5% and stocks are priced to give you 4%, that's not much of a risk premium, is it? We also break it down into U.S. large cap growth, and there we come up with only 2.5% return, which is roughly zero in real terms. Basically, we're saying the growth value spread has widened tremendously, and so there's likely to be mean reversion there as well, where growth stocks are likely, they already have a lower yield. They historically, empirically have growth rates that are not dissimilar to value. That surprises most people. And the mean reversion is takes out even more than it does for large cap in general. We've never had a market more concentrated than today. The top 5 stocks add up to nearly 30% of the S&P. We've never been that high ever before in history. Peak of the dot-com bubble, it was about 18%. So with a market that concentrated, the so-called Magnificent Seven either have to have stupendous growth to justify their huge market cap, or there's liable to be mean reversion. And so we don't know which will happen, but they have to exceed stupendous growth expectations in order to outperform the market on a go-forward basis. So this is a wonderful tool that helps people pivot from looking at past returns, which is addictive. Everyone looks at past returns, and human nature conditions us to look at past returns and think that's what the future is going to have in store for us. Nobody likes to buy a bargain for the simple reason that bargains got there by inflicting pain and losses. Nobody likes to sell a big winner because the presumption is it's been a big winner for great reasons and it will continue to be a big winner. No, it's already in the price. The good news is already in the price. It has to exceed expectations to continue to win. And so this is a tool that recognizes that the constituent parts of return are very simple. What's the income on the asset? What's the growth rate in that income? And what will mean reversion do for us if to help or hurt our returns? So right now, the spread between growth and value is very nearly the widest it's ever been. It's similar to what it was at the top of the dot-com bubble. It's similar to what it was in the aftermath of the COVID-induced value crash. Biggest spread ever. The spread between large cap and small cap is the biggest in history. One interpretation is that's a new normal, in which case you're still better off with the value and the small cap because the yields are higher. Another interpretation is there might be mean reversion, in which case you really want small cap and value and non-U.S. investments, all of which are trading cheap relative to history in the U.S. is an outlier. So I look at today as an opportunity-rich environment. There's a lot of asset classes that are cheap. priced to give us terrific forward-looking returns. And there's a handful, not that many asset classes that are priced to give you a really pretty lousy forward return. S&P 500 and Russell 1000 are priced to give you less than bonds in our estimation. And growth is priced to give you less than that. It resembles the top of the dot-com bubble to me.
Rob, thank you very much for spending this time with us today. We always appreciate it, and you are always welcome on Excess Returns, so thank you.
This has been a real privilege. Thanks for carving out time for this.
This is Justin again. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Excess Returns. You can follow Jack on Twitter at @PracticalQuant. You follow me on Twitter at @JJCarbonell. If you found this discussion interesting and valuable, please subscribe in either iTunes or on YouTube, or leave a review or a comment. We appreciate it.